The samurai stood alone at the village gate, his hand resting lightly on the scabbard of a sword that hadn't seen battle in years. Dust rose on the horizon, and soon a lavish palanquin appeared, carried by sweating bearers whose sandals scraped against the dirt road. The villagers gathered, whispering. This was the moment his solitude was supposed to end. The bride promised to him by arrangement had finally arrived. But when the curtain lifted, silence spread like wildfire. From the palanquin stepped a woman, towering above all, her presence twice his size, her shadow falling over him like a challenge from the heavens themselves. Children gasped, elders exchanged uneasy glances, and even the cicadas seemed to fall quiet. What fate awaited a samurai whose bride's shadow was larger than his own? The story unfolded in the middle of the Edo period, a time when peace had stretched long enough for people to forget the chaos of constant wars, but not long enough for the weight of honor to loosen its grip on men. Villages like his lived in the shadow of powerful daimyo, where every action, every marriage, carried the echo of politics and pride. He was called Harunaga, though most in the village simply knew him as the quiet samurai. Unlike the warriors sung about in ballads, Harunaga bore no scars of glory, no tales of daring duels. His life had been a string of routine duties, guarding storehouses, teaching children the etiquette of the sword, bowing in silence to superiors who rarely noticed him. He was neither disgraced nor celebrated, merely invisible. Yet in a society built on appearances, invisibility was a wound deeper than any blade could cut. He ate alone in the evenings, sitting cross-legged before a chipped shawan, lifting rice to his mouth with measured movements. Sometimes, in the quiet of his hut, he would draw his sword halfway from its scabbard, staring at the blade dulled by neglect. Then, with a sigh, he would sheath it again. His life was like the sword itself, once sharp, now waiting for a purpose. When the marriage was announced, whispers spread across the village. For Harunaga, it was not romance he anticipated, but recognition. A wife meant status. A union meant visibility. Even if love never came, perhaps respect would. The arrangement was said to be blessed by distant relatives with stronger ties, and so he prepared himself in silence, folding his hakama neatly, polishing sandals that had lost their shine. On the morning his bride was to arrive, the air felt different. Banners hung at the gate, fluttered in a restless wind, as if the village itself held its breath. Children ran ahead to see the palanquin's arrival, their laughter mingling with the distant twang of a shamisen being plucked somewhere unseen. The elders gathered, adjusting their robes, ready to judge. Harunaga waited with steady posture, though inside his chest his heart beat like a taiko drum before a battle. He imagined a woman of delicate grace, perhaps shy, perhaps stern, but small enough to fit neatly into the mold of the village's expectations. He imagined her bowing politely, stepping down with measured elegance, becoming a mirror of his own restraint. But when the palanquin arrived and the curtain stirred, his breath caught. From within stepped Tomoe, the woman chosen to be his bride. Towering, broad-shouldered, her presence impossible to ignore. She carried herself not with arrogance, but with a quiet dignity that silenced even the cruelest whispers for a heartbeat. Her shadow covered him like a canopy, her stature breaking the fragile image he had painted. Gasps escaped the villagers' lips, followed by murmurs that spread like sparks through dry grass. Harunaga kept his eyes fixed on her, his face a mask of calm. but his hand tightened slightly on the scabbard of his old rusting sword. The shock of the unexpected bride sets the stage for conflict. The silence that followed her arrival did not last. Within moments, the village erupted in murmurs. Old women leaned closer to one another, hiding their mouths behind wrinkled hands, their whispers sharp as blades. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, pointing with wide eyes before being hushed. Young men, too proud to conceal their amusement, let out half-suppressed laughs that quickly spread like cracks through ice. Harunaga stood unmoving, every muscle stiff beneath his simple indigo kimono. He could feel their stares, piercing him as much as they measured her. The contrast was undeniable. He, lean and of modest height, his shoulders narrow from years of quiet duty. She, towering, broad-shouldered, her presence filling the air like thunderclouds before a storm. The villagers did not see a marriage. They saw a mismatch, a spectacle, something to gossip about for years to come. An elder cleared his throat and muttered, "The gods must be jesting. Look at the pair of them." As if a sparrow were made to wet a crane, his words rippled through the crowd, leaving behind smirks and raised brows. Another man, less subtle, whispered loud enough for Harunaga to hear. How will he protect her when she could shield him instead? Every remark struck him like arrows. Yet, Tomoe did not flinch. She held her chin high, her eyes steady, as if the weight of 100 gazers were nothing to her. Tomoe's movements were deliberate, her steps heavy yet graceful, each sandal pressing into the dirt, as if to root herself into the ground of a place that already rejected her. Harunaga stole a glance at her profile. Her face was not harsh, but serene, her gaze forward, unbothered. It unnerved him, not her size, but her calmness, her unshaken dignity in the midst of ridicule. He wanted to speak, to break the silence between them, but the words clung to his throat. The murmurs grew bolder as the crowd followed them toward the elder's house, where the marriage rites would be blessed. Lanterns swayed in the breeze, casting trembling shadows across wooden walls. Laughter slipped between those shadows, low at first, then sharper, more cutting. By the time they reached the threshold, Harunaga could feel the air itself pushing against him. Not the weight of his bride, but the judgment of his people. When the doors slid open, the elder gestured them inside. Harunaga bowed, though his stomach churned. His bride did the same, though she bent lower than expected, her form humble, despite her stature. That simple bow silenced even the cruelest whispers for a breath, but it would not last. As the door closed behind them, Harunaga realized the stairs outside would not vanish. They would follow him, haunt him, question his worth with every step he took beside her. And yet, in that fleeting silence, he wondered, was she stronger than the judgment itself? Or was she simply accustomed to bearing it, as if this ridicule were nothing new? The crowd's judgment sets the stage for tension between appearances and inner strength. Inside the elder's house, the air was heavy with the scent of old tatami mats and burning incense. The murmurs of the villagers faded behind sliding doors, replaced by the faint creak of wood as the couple sat opposite each other. Between them, a lacquered tray with 2 cups of tea steamed gently, untouched. Harunaga kept his eyes lowered at first, studying the patterns in the straw mat as if they held the right words he could not find. His hand rested on his knee, rigid, his other hand brushing against the scabbard at his side, as though the sword might give him courage. He had faced men with blades drawn. Yet he found himself more unsettled by the quiet presence of Tomoe across from him. Tomoe sat with her back perfectly straight, her large hands folded over her lap. The weight of her frame made the floor groan faintly beneath her, but her movements were precise, graceful, in a way that contrasted with the murmurs outside. When at last she lifted her eyes, they met his without hesitation, dark, steady, calm. The silence stretched until Harunaga finally spoke, his voice low. "You must have heard them," he said, not looking up. "They're whispers." Her lips curved, not quite into a smile, but into something close, a recognition. "I have heard such whispers for as long as I can remember," she replied softly. "A woman too tall, too broad, too much. They think I am not meant for quiet places or soft lives." Harunaga's gaze flickered up, caught off guard by her honesty. The tone of her voice carried neither bitterness nor complaint, only a simple statement, as if she were reciting a fact of nature. "You do not seem troubled," he said. "I learned long ago that shame belongs to those who speak it, not to me." She reached for the tea, lifting the delicate porcelain cup in her large hands. The contrast was striking. Fragility cradled by strength. She sipped, then placed it back gently, her eyes never leaving his. Something stirred in Harunaga then. Not yet respect, not yet affection, but a quiet recognition. He had spent years fading into the background, his existence barely acknowledged by others. And yet, here was a woman who carried a weight far heavier than invisibility, the weight of constant scrutiny. And still, she sat unbroken. For the first time that day, Harunaga's lips moved into the faintest trace of a smile. He lifted his own cup, his hand trembling only slightly, and drank. The tea was bitter, earthy, grounding. No more words passed between them, but in the silence, something shifted. Not approval, not acceptance, but the fragile beginning of an understanding neither had expected. The first spark of mutual recognition forms, hinting that beneath awkwardness lies an unexpected bond. That night, after the formalities ended and the elders had retired, Harunaga guided his new bride to the modest house prepared for them. It was small, almost humble for a samurai's dwelling. A thatched roof, creaking wood, a single lantern burning faintly against the darkness. The villagers had watched them walk through the streets, their whispers trailing like smoke. But once the door closed, silence returned, thick and pressing. She moved slowly through the room, her head nearly brushing the low beams. She studied the space with a calm face, though Harunaga could sense a trace of something else. Not disappointment, but familiarity. As though she had known smaller homes, smaller welcomes, all her life. When he unrolled the futon and placed it on the tatami, he finally asked Tomoe the question that had been gnawing at him. "Do you resent this?" Her eyes lingered on the flickering lantern before turning to him. "No. A roof is a roof. A silence is kinder than cruel words. I have known homes filled with both." Harunaga hesitated, then pressed. "Homes?" Tomoe lowered herself onto the tatami with deliberate grace, her knees folding neatly despite her size. Her voice grew softer, like a thread unraveling. "My father gave me away 3 times before this. Each time, I was returned. Too large for the chamber, too awkward for the ceremonies, too visible for the men who wanted wives they could hide behind. They saw me as shame, not partner. Each time I was sent back, I carried not belongings, but their laughter. Their houses remembered me with mockery." Harunaga's chest tightened. He had known invisibility, the ache of being overlooked, but this was something else. To be seen, constantly, only to be rejected. Where he had longed for recognition, she had longed for refuge from it. "Then why agree again?" he asked quietly. Her gaze met his with steady calm. "Because even a woman, twice the size of her husband, can still dream. I dreamt once that someone might look at me and not see a burden, but a companion. Perhaps foolish dreams linger longest." The lantern sputtered, casting a trembling light across her face. Harunaga studied her features. Not grotesque, not monstrous, simply strong, carved with quiet endurance. And in that endurance, he saw something he had not found in himself: resilience. The night deepened. Outside, the voices of villagers still lingered faintly in the distance, like ghosts clinging to the walls. But inside, their silence felt different now, less oppressive, more like a space where unspoken truths could rest. Her past rejections expose her scars, but also her resilience, leaving Harunaga to question what kind of bond could be forged from two wounded lives. Morning light spilled through the paper screens, pale and hesitant, as though even the sun was wary of what the village now whispered. Harunaga rose early, tying his hakama with precise movements. But his mind was restless. The marriage had been sealed by the rites, yet outside those thin walls, the union was far from accepted. When he stepped out, he felt their eyes upon him. Farmers, bent over rice paddies, lifted their heads. Women washing clothes by the river slowed their hands. Even children paused mid-play, their laughter replaced by curious stares. Harunaga had been invisible for so long that the sudden weight of attention pressed on him like armor he had never chosen to wear. At the well, two men spoke without lowering their voices. "He'll bring shame on the village," one said. "Or perhaps she'll protect us all herself," the other mocked, and they both laughed. Harunaga's hand brushed against his scabbard. His sword, the blade dulled and forgotten, remained at his side, more ornament than weapon. He felt its weight now, heavy with meaning. What was honor, if not the respect of one's peers? And what was shame, if the entire village declared it so? When he returned home, Tomoe was already awake, kneeling quietly as she mended a tear in the futon. Her large hands moved delicately, threading the needle with surprising ease. She looked up, her calm gaze meeting his troubled one. "They will not stop," Harunaga admitted, his voice low. "Every step we take, every word we breathe, they will measure and find lacking." Tomoe tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "Then let them measure," she said softly. "If their scales are crooked, why should we carry the burden of their judgment?" Her simplicity cut through him. He wanted to believe it, yet the teachings of his life thundered louder. Honor was not a private matter. It lived and died in the eyes of others. A samurai was bound to duty, to appearance, to the fragile balance of respect. If the village rejected this union, then did he not risk becoming less than a man of the sword? A hollow name, mocked until forgotten? That night, unable to sleep, Harunaga sat alone with his sword. He slid the blade halfway from its scabbard, its surface catching the lantern light in fractured glimmers. Rust spotted the steel, dulling what once had been sharp. He stared at it, seeing himself reflected in that weakened edge. A warrior whose honor had eroded under years of silence. For a moment, he considered. If he refused the marriage, perhaps the whispers would end. Perhaps the village would breathe easier. Perhaps his name would be spared ridicule. But as he stared into the blade, he heard again her words from the night before. Even a woman twice the size of her husband, can still dream. He closed the scabbard with a firm snap. His doubts remained, heavy as ever, yet somewhere beneath them, a seed of defiance stirred. Harunaga stands between duty to society and the fragile seed of defiance growing in him. In the days that followed were a test sharper than any blade. The marriage was sealed by ritual, yet the hearts of the villagers remained closed. Whispers turned into open words, muttered not behind hands, but aloud in the marketplace, at the well, even in the fields where Harunaga once walked unnoticed. "Too strange a pair," one elder remarked, his voice carrying across the gathering hall. "The gods may frown upon such imbalance." Another added, "A union should bring harmony." This brings laughter. And shame, Harunaga sat in silence through these discussions, his head bowed, though inside each word struck him like hammer blows. His hand often brushed against his sword, but he never drew it. A samurai's honor was not defended with steel against his own people, yet the weight of restraint burned heavier than combat. And Tomoe? She endured it all with the same calm composure she had shown from the first day. She did not argue, nor lower her head in defeat. Instead, she began to act. When children laughed at her height, she crouched down, producing small sweets she had prepared, offering them with a smile. When old women whispered as she passed, she carried water buckets to their doorsteps, saving them weary steps. At the riverbank, she knelt beside the younger wives, her broad hands washing clothes with precision, never flinching at their stares. Her actions spoke louder than any defense Harunaga could have made. Yet, rather than silencing criticism, they fueled another kind of discomfort. "She is too bold," some muttered. "She does not know her place," others whispered. Harunaga watched, torn between shame and admiration. Shame because the union continued to stain his name in the village's eyes. Admiration because Tomoe's quiet strength was undeniable. She faced the same judgment he feared, and yet where he bent beneath it, she stood unshaken. One evening, during a council of elders, a man finally voiced what many had thought. "End this union," he said bluntly. "Send her away before the laughter spreads to neighboring villages. A samurai must guard his honor above all else." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Harunaga. He felt the breath of 100 years of tradition pressing against his chest. His fingers brushed the scabbard of his rusted sword, and for a heartbeat he imagined drawing it, not against an enemy, but against the suffocating weight of expectation. But he did not move. He lowered his gaze, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. In that silence, Tomoe's calm voice rose steady and clear. "If you see shame, it is yours to carry," she said simply. "I will continue to live as I am." Her words, unadorned and fearless, left the hall trembling with unease. Harunaga's chest tightened. For the first time, it was not his voice that stood against them. It was hers. The village's resistance hardens, but Tomoe's quiet defiance plants the seed of change. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers of the village did not vanish. But something subtle began to shift. Where others expected Tomoe to retreat beneath the weight of ridicule, she moved through each day with quiet determination. Her presence woven into the fabric of the village life in ways none had foreseen. At dawn, she was seen carrying water jars from the well, her broad shoulders balancing the weight, as though it were nothing. She did not keep the water for herself, but left it at the doors of elderly neighbors, bowing silently before moving on. By midday, she could be found in the fields, her hands muddy as she bent beside farmers, pulling weeds and tending seedlings. Children stared at first, mocking her sighs, but soon their laughter changed into curiosity when she plaited crowns of wildflowers for them with surprising gentleness. One evening, a child fell while chasing a hoop, his knees scraped and bleeding. The boy cried, his mother rushing in panic. It was Tomoe who knelt first, her large frame folding small, her hands steady as she tore a strip of her own sleeve to bind the wound. The child stared at her, wide-eyed, as if expecting pain. Instead, she whispered, "A scar is proof that you were brave." For the first time, laughter did not follow her words, only silence and awe. Harunaga watched all this in silence. At first, he feared her boldness would only deepen the village's scorn, but slowly he began to notice the change in the villagers' eyes. Where there had been mockery, now there was hesitation. The old women, who once whispered, now accepted the water at their doorsteps without complaint. The farmers, once dismissive, began to nod their thanks in quiet acknowledgement. The children, once cruel, now lingered near her, curious, almost trusting. And yet, not all hearts softened. Some muttered that she sought to prove herself too much, that humility, not boldness, was a wife's place. Harunaga felt the sting of those words, torn between the traditions drilled into him and the undeniable truth he witnessed. Tomoe's strength was not pride, but compassion. Her presence, not shame, but salvation. One night, as they sat together, Harunaga broke the silence. "You do more for them than I ever have," he admitted. His voice was low, almost ashamed. Tomoe turned to him, her eyes calm, her tone simple. "We cannot choose how they see us. Only how we act." While they watched, her words lingered, heavier than steel, cutting deeper than any blade. For Harunaga, it was as if the rust on his sword mirrored the rust in his spirit, both waiting for a spark to be sharpened again. Tomoe's compassion begins to turn ridicule into reluctant respect, while Harunaga feels the weight of his own inaction. The first whispers came from traveling merchants. At the edge of the market, as villagers traded rice for cloth and salt, a peddler lowered his voice. "The roads are no longer safe," he warned. "A band of Ronin-turned-bandits stalks the countryside. Villages smaller than yours have been stripped clean." His words spread quickly, like sparks carried by the wind. By dusk, the warnings became more tangible. A farmer returned from tending distant paddies, pale-faced, claiming he saw smoke rising from a neighboring hamlet. Another swore he had glimpsed riders on the ridge, their silhouettes black against the dying light. Fear crept into the air, thicker with every retelling. The elders called a gathering at the shrine, their voices quivering, though they tried to appear composed. "We must prepare," one declared, his hands shaking. "But what defense do we have? Our samurai has not drawn his blade in years." His eyes fell on Harunaga, and silence followed, heavy as stone. Harunaga felt the weight of that silence more than the steel at his side. For years, the villagers had ignored him, laughed at him, doubted him. Now, in their fear, they looked to him, not out of respect, but desperation. His sword, rusted though it was, became the fragile line between survival and ruin. That night, Harunaga sat outside his home, staring at the sky. The stars were veiled by clouds, and the air smelled of distant smoke. Beside him, Tomoe carried bundles of firewood into neat stacks, her movements steady, as though preparing for a long night. She broke the silence with words as simple as they were piercing. "Fear sharpens or breaks a man, Which will it do to you? He did not answer immediately. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, sliding it halfway from its scabbard. The blade caught the moonlight, its surface pitted and dull. Shame washed over him. How could such a weapon stand against real enemies? How could he? Tomoe's gaze softened as she studied him. A blade may dull, she said, but a spirit may still cut deep. Decide which you will sharpen. Her words struck him like a strike of flint against stone. He looked at her, not at her size, not at the whispers that still clung to them, but at the calm fire in her eyes. For the first time, he wondered if his strength might be less in proving himself alone and more in standing beside her. But dawn would soon test them both. The smoke in the distance was no illusion, and the ridge was no phantom. The bandits were coming. The village trembles before an approaching threat, while Harunaga faces the choice of sharpening his spirit or breaking under fear. The next morning, the village awoke to tension thick as fog. Men whispered of sharpening tools. Women gathered grain and cloth as if preparing for flight. Children were ushered indoors, their laughter replaced by anxious silence. Harunaga walked through the streets with his sword at his side, feeling their eyes on him again. This time not mocking, but pleading. He was their shield, whether he was ready or not. Back at their home, Tomoe waited for him in the courtyard. She had stripped off her outer robe, standing in a simple work kimono that freed her arms. Her expression was calm, but there was a glint of determination in her gaze. "Teach me," she said, plainly. Harunaga frowned. "Teach you?" "The blade," Tomoe replied. "If bandits come, I will not sit behind doors while others fight." His first instinct was to refuse. A samurai's art was not meant for women, least of all his wife. Tradition pressed against his chest like a weight, urging him to protect her, to keep her hidden. But when he met her eyes, he saw not fear, but resolve, steady as stone. He hesitated, then drew his blade. The steel groaned as it left the scabbard, dulled by years of neglect. Tomoe picked up a wooden practice staff he had used once to train children. She held it with both hands, her posture awkward but firm. "Stand ready," Harunaga instructed. What followed unsettled him. Though untrained, Tomoe moved with a raw power that startled him. Her strikes were heavy, forcing him back a step with each swing. He countered with technique, precise and sharp, yet her sheer strength nearly matched his skill. At one point, her staff struck his blade with such force that the old steel vibrated in his hands. Breathless, Harunaga lowered his weapon. She stood opposite him, hair loose around her face, eyes unflinching. "You fight like a storm," he admitted. She shook her head. "No, I fight like someone who has been told all her life to stay still. When the time comes, I will not." The words pierced deeper than her strikes. Harunaga realized that while he had hidden behind silence and invisibility, Tomoe had been forged in the fire of rejection, her will tempered like steel. Where he feared shame, she defied it. That evening, villagers passing by stopped at the gate to watch. Whispers spread again, but this time they carried awe rather than mockery. A samurai and his towering wife, training side by side beneath the fading sun. The image lingered in their minds. Some muttered disapproval, others wonder, but none could look away. Harunaga wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest rising with labored breath. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of purpose in his muscles, the echo of pride not borrowed from his ancestors, but born from his own struggle. And standing opposite him, Tomoe's steady gaze told him he no longer fought alone. Tomoe's strength shocks Harunaga, forcing him to confront his own weakness, and hinting that their survival may depend on her as much as on him. That night, the sound of bamboo rustling outside their home seemed louder than usual, each sway against the wind echoing the unease in Harunaga's chest. He sat by the lantern's dim glow, his sword across his knees, tracing the pitted steel with his fingers. Tomoe slept quietly across the room, her breath steady, untroubled, as though the training had lifted a burden from her shoulders rather than added one. But for Harunaga, it was the opposite. Every strike she had delivered still reverberated through his arms. He could not ignore the truth. Her raw strength outmatched his. Even dulled by inexperience, she was a force he could not deny. And that truth gnawed at him. A samurai was protector, shield, blade. His role was clear, defined by centuries of code. What honor was left if his wife, mocked and ridiculed by the world, stood stronger than he did? What face could he show the ancestors if survival meant leaning on her strength? The doubts circled like crows in his mind. He recalled the elders' words, their demand to end the union. Was this what they had feared? That he would be diminished by her presence, his name swallowed by ridicule? He clenched his fists, the scabbard groaning under his grip. The lantern flickered and Tomoe stirred. Her eyes opened, catching the faint light, and she spoke without lifting her head. "You are awake still." "Yes," Harunaga muttered. "You are troubled." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the night insects outside. At last he said, "If I cannot protect you, if I cannot even match you, what am I?" Tomoe sat up slowly, her hair loose around her shoulders. She studied him with calm eyes, unshaken. "You are Harunaga," she answered simply. "A man who has endured silence and judgment longer than most could bear. Strength is not only in arms. Sometimes it is in standing when the world wishes you to kneel." Her words were steady, unyielding. Yet Harunaga felt no comfort. Her faith in him felt heavier than mockery, for he feared he could not live up to it. When she lay back down, drifting once more into calm sleep, Harunaga remained by the lantern, staring at his rusted blade. The flame trembled, its light catching on the steel, as though mocking him with flashes of brilliance it no longer possessed. By dawn, his decision was still clouded. He admired her, yes. He even felt the stirrings of something deeper, respect, perhaps even the roots of affection. But pride gnawed at him, and fear coiled tighter around his chest. He did not know whether he could stand beside her without being consumed by shame. Harunaga wrestles with his pride, torn between admiration for Tomoe and the fear that her strength diminishes his honor. It began with smoke, a thin column rising beyond the ridge, curling into the twilight sky. Then came the sound of hooves, the distant thunder that made the earth itself shiver. By the time the first cries reached the village, panic had already taken root. Mothers clutched their children, farmers grabbed hoes and sickles, and doors slammed shut in frantic succession. The bandits swept in like a dark tide, faces masked with cloth, blades drawn, their laughter sharp and merciless. They moved with the ease of men who had done this before, scattering villages with the swing of a sword, tearing open storehouses, dragging sacks of rice into the night. Harunaga stood at the edge of the main street, his hand on the hilt of his sword. His heart pounded like a drum. For years, he had dreamed of recognition, of being seen as a warrior. Now all eyes would turn to him, but not with admiration, They would see if his blade, rusted and dull, could still cut. A bandit charged toward him, a crude spear raised high. Harunaga drew his sword, the steel groaning as it left the scabbard. Their weapons clashed, sparks bursting in the night. The impact rattled his arms. He parried once, twice, but his rusted edge slid clumsily against polished steel. The bandit sneered, pressing forward, and for a breath, Harunaga faltered. He heard villagers screaming, saw them scattering like leaves in the wind. His knees threatened to buckle. Am I protector or shadow? The thought echoed in his skull as the bandit forced him back. Then, from the corner of his eye, a towering figure moved. Tomoe. She seized a wooden beam from a half-collapsed stall and swung it with both hands. The bandit was thrown aside like straw, the beam splintering under the force. Her voice cut through the chaos, not with words, but with a raw cry that pulled every gaze toward her. She stood like a pillar in the storm, broad shoulders squared, daring the bandits to approach. For a heartbeat, the raiders hesitated. A woman was not supposed to fight, yet she did, and with terrifying strength. Harunaga's chest burned with shame and awe. His instinct was to protest, to tell her to flee, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he tightened his grip on the sword, forcing his trembling legs to steady. Another bandit lunged. This time, Harunaga met the strike with a roar of his own, the rusted blade catching enough light to blind for a heartbeat before slashing across his foe's arm. Blood sprayed. The bandit stumbled back, cursing. Harunaga's breath came ragged, but for the first time in years, his sword had tasted battle. The street erupted into chaos. Steel clashing, villagers crying, fire spreading from a torch flung onto a thatched roof. Harunaga and Tomoe stood in the center, side by side, the line between shame and survival thinning with every strike. The battle has begun. Harunaga finally draws blood, but it is Tomoe's presence that steadies the village against the storm. The village had become a furnace of chaos, smoke curling from burning rooftops, cries echoing through narrow lanes, and the clang of steel, ringing like temple bells, struck in fury. Harunaga's blade carved shallow lines against his foes, but each strike left his arms trembling, his breath ragged. He fought not with glory, but with desperation. Then a scream tore through the night. Harunaga turned in time to see a child stumble, trapped between two bandits. The men laughed as they closed in, blades gleaming in the firelight. For a heartbeat, Harunaga froze. Too far, too slow. But Tomoe moved. She charged with the weight of a storm, her body a wall of determination. With her bare hands, she seized one bandit by the collar and flung him aside, his body crashing into a wooden stall that splintered under the impact. She wrenched the sword from the other's grasp and struck him with the flat of the blade, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The child darted into her arms, clinging to her sleeve, eyes wide with terror that soon softened into awe. Villagers who had cowered in shadows stared, mouths open. A woman, mocked, doubted, judged, stood as their savior while men faltered. Even the bandits hesitated, unnerved by her ferocity. Harunaga's chest heaved as he watched, torn between pride and a sting that cut deeper than any wound. His whole life, he had waited for a moment to prove himself, and yet here it was Tomoe who bore the weight of courage, her every movement defying not only the bandits, but the narrow world that had caged her for so long. Another cry echoed, this time from an elder cornered by raiders. Again, Tomoe surged forward, intercepting, wielding the stolen blade with surprising ease. Her strikes were not refined, not shaped by years of kata or formality. They were raw, born of necessity, but each carried the power of conviction. Where her size had once been called a curse, it now became the very force that shielded the helpless. For the first time, murmurs spread through the villages, not of ridicule, but of reverence. "She is stronger than a dozen of us," one whispered. "Perhaps the gods did not mock us after all," another muttered. Harunaga tightened his grip on his sword. He could not deny it. Tomoe was no burden. She was the shield he had longed to be, the presence that turned despair into defiance. And standing beside her, his shame shifted, not vanishing, but transforming into a question that burned hotter than fire. Was honor found in standing taller than others, or in standing together? Tomoe saves lives before the eyes of the village, her strength undeniable, forcing Harunaga to question everything he thought honor meant. The village burned on every side. Flames licked the thatched roofs, sparks carried by the wind into the black night. Shadows of bandits moved like phantoms between the firelight, their shouts mixing with the cries of terrified villagers. For all his training, Harunaga had never felt a battlefield so close, so personal. This was not the oddly clash of armies. It was chaos, raw and merciless. Harunaga struck down one opponent, but his arms trembled, his blade heavy as stone. Another bandit rushed him, and he stumbled back, his footing slipping in the dirt. Before the killing blow could fall, Tomoe appeared at his side. With a roar, she swung the stolen blade, forcing the enemy back. Her stance was unrefined, but the sheer weight of her strike shattered the man's guard, sending him sprawling. Their eyes met, his narrow and sharp, hers steady and burning with determination. For the first time, Harunaga did not feel diminished by her strength. Instead, he felt carried by it, as if her presence steadied the ground beneath his feet. "Together," she said simply, her breath heavy, but voice unshaken. And together, they fought. Harunaga's blade, though dulled by years of neglect, moved with the precision of training drilled into his bones. Tomoe's strikes, raw and powerful, broke the enemy's defenses wide open. Where he faltered in strength, she filled the gap. Where she lacked finesse, his discipline guided the flow. They were no longer two mismatched figures mocked by the village. They were one force, blades and wills aligned. The bandits soon realized their mistake. What they had seen as weakness, a quiet samurai and his towering wife, had become an unbreakable wall. The pair fought side by side, their movements forming an unexpected rhythm. His blade cutting, hers crashing, his defense guarding, hers striking back with unrelenting ferocity. Around them, villagers who had hidden began to stir. Some lifted hoes and sickles, emboldened by the sight of the unlikely pair standing firm against trained killers. What began as whispers turned into shouts, cries not of fear, but of courage. Harunaga felt something shift within him. With every strike he delivered beside Tomoe, the weight of shame loosened. Her presence did not erase his honor. It restored it, reshaped it. He was not less for needing her strength. He was more for fighting alongside her. When the last of the raiders on their street fled into the shadows, Harunaga lowered his sword, his breath ragged. Tomoe stood beside him, her chest heaving, her sleeve torn, a line of blood across her cheek. Not hers, but a mark of battle. In the glow of firelight, she looked not like an outcast, but like a warrior, forged in defiance of every cruel word ever spoken. For the first time, Harunaga allowed himself to bow slightly toward her, a gesture not of duty, but of respect. Harunaga and Tomoe's combined strength turns the tide of battle. But the true test still awaits. The leader of the bandits has yet to appear. When the last of the lesser bandits fell or fled into the burning night, a heavy silence descended on the street. Only the crackle of fire and the ragged breaths of the villagers broke it. Harunaga's chest rose and fell like a drum beaten in exhaustion, his blade slick with sweat and grime. He almost dared to think the worst was over. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. From the smoke at the edge of the square emerged a figure taller than any other man there, clad in patched armor taken from forgotten battlefields. His eyes glowed in the firelight, cold and merciless. The villagers shrank back instantly, their renewed courage dissolving into fear. The man carried a massive nodachi, a great sword longer than Harunaga's entire arm span. Its edge gleamed with recent blood, and he rested it easily across his shoulder, as if it were no heavier than a branch. "So," the bandit chief rumbled, his voice thick as gravel, "this is your defender? A rusted sword and a wife too large for her kimono?" He laughed, and the cruel sound echoed against the burning walls. Harunaga felt every eye turn to him. The villagers who had whispered their doubts, who had mocked, who had begged him to protect them. All of them now waited to see if he would rise or fall. His throat tightened. His sword, though drawn, seemed suddenly small, inadequate against the massive blade his opponent carried. Tomoe stepped forward, fury flashing in her eyes, but Harunaga raised a hand, stopping her. His voice, though low, carried across the square. "This fight is mine." The chief sneered. "Then you will die for them." The two men closed the distance. The clash was immediate. Steel against steel, sparks exploding into the night. The sheer weight of the nodachi drove Harunaga back with each blow, his arms screaming in pain, his knees nearly buckling. He countered with precision, but every strike felt like a pebble thrown against a boulder. The villagers gasped with each near fall, their hopes teetering on the edge of collapse. Harunaga's grip began to slip, sweat burning his palms. The chief roared, swinging the great blade downward in a strike that could have cleaved him in two. Harunaga barely managed to block, the impact driving him to his knees. His sword trembled, the rusted edge cracking under the force. For a heartbeat, despair flooded him. The whispers of the elders, the ridicule of the villagers, the shadow of his own doubt, they all pressed against him in that moment, heavier than the enemy's sword. His blade was breaking, and so was he. Then, from the side, Tomoe's voice cut through the chaos. "Harunaga!" He looked up, meeting her eyes. They burned with the same fire she had carried since stepping out of the palanquin, unshaken, unashamed. Her gaze did not pity him. It demanded he stand. With a ragged breath, Harunaga pushed back against the crushing blade. His teeth gritted, his spirit flaring like steel, struck against flint. The duel had only just begun. Harunaga faces the bandit chief alone, his rusted sword already beginning to break. But Tomoe's presence gives him the spark to endure. The bandit chief pressed harder, his nodachi bearing down like a mountain. Sparks flying as the rusted edge of Harunaga's blade cracked under the strain. Each blow echoed like thunder, each step backward a reminder that defeat was seconds away. Harunaga's knees bent, his breath tore from his lungs, and despair clawed at the edges of his mind. But through the chaos, Tomoe's voice rang out again, not frantic, not pleading, but commanding. "Stand, Harunaga, you are more than their whispers." The words pierced deeper than steel. His arms shook, but something within him stirred. The memory of every silent meal, every ignored bow, every long year spent invisible, all of it condensed into a single flame, fed not by pride alone, but by the presence of the woman who had refused to bend where he had. With a roar, Harunaga twisted, deflecting the massive blade enough to stagger free. The villagers gasped. He raised his sword again, battered and chipped but still in his hands. And for the first time, his stance felt steady. The bandit chief snarled and charged, but before his strike could fall, another figure entered the clash. Tomoe. She wielded the stolen blade from earlier, her body moving with raw power, her strike colliding with the Nodachi in a shattering crash that split the night. The chief faltered, surprised by the force of her blow. Side by side, they fought, Harunaga's movements precise, cutting where gaps opened, Tomoe's strikes heavy, breaking the enemy's guard wide. The rhythm they had discovered in training now became their lifeline. He parried, she struck, he dodged, she countered. Two mismatched figures, moving as one. The villagers watched in stunned silence. Where once they had laughed, now they trembled at the sight of a pair fighting with the spirit of a dozen. Even the bandits, circling nervously at the edges, hesitated, their courage faltering. At last, Harunaga saw his opening. The chief swung the Nodachi in a wide arc, overcommitting his strength. In that instant, time seemed to fracture. The world fell silent, fire crackled in slow motion, embers floated like drifting stars, the gasp of the villagers hung frozen in the air. Harunaga stepped forward, deflecting just enough for Tomoe to drive her blade into the chief's side with a cry that split the night. The giant staggered, his eyes wide with shock, his weapon slipping from his grip. Harunaga raised his cracked sword. For a heartbeat, the broken steel gleamed like polished silver, as if the spirit of every forgotten warrior breathed through it one last time. With a final shout, he brought it down across the chief's chest. The man fell, crashing into the dirt, and the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath his weight. Silence followed. Then the villagers exhaled as one, a tide of disbelief, breaking into cheers that filled the burning night. The bandit chief lies defeated, the village safe. But the true resolution lies in how the people will see Harunaga and Tomoe after this night. Dawn broke over the village, pale light, washing away the smoke of the night before. The fires had died, leaving behind charred beams and blackened earth. Yet among the ruins, the villagers stood alive. Their voices, once sharpened into whispers of mockery, now rose with gratitude. Children pointed at Tomoe, not with laughter, but with awe. Elders who had demanded the union be broken now bowed their heads in silence, unable to meet her gaze. At the center of it all, Harunaga and Tomoe stood side by side. His sword, cracked, its edge shattered, rested in his hands. What once had been a dull ornament of shame had, at last, served its purpose. Yet even in its brokenness, the blade seemed truer than before, a reflection of the man himself, scarred, tested, but not defeated. Harunaga laid the sword on the steps of the shrine, bowing deeply before the kami. When he rose, he no longer felt the weight of invisibility pressing on his chest. He had not won the battle alone, nor had he done it with flawless skill. He had won because he had stood, and because Tomoe had stood beside him. Tomoe, too, was transformed in the villagers' eyes. Where once they had seen only her size, now they saw the countless small gestures she had offered them. The water left at their doors, the hands that had mended wounds, the strength that had driven back fear when even warriors faltered. She was no longer too much. She was exactly what the village had needed. In the days that followed, whispers changed. She saved us, they said. He fought with her. Farmers bowed in gratitude, and even the elders, once stubborn, spoke Tomoe's name with reverence. One morning, Harunaga watched a group of children in the square. A boy picked up a bamboo stick, holding it clumsily like a sword. Another girl, taller than the rest, snatched a branch twice his size and laughed, mimicking Tomoe's battle cry. Instead of mockery, the children cheered her name. Tomoe! Tomoe! As they replayed the knight's courage in their games. Harunaga turned to see Tomoe standing nearby, her eyes soft as she watched. For the first time, she was not merely enduring their gaze. She was honored by it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Harunaga placed his broken sword at the shrine. Petals of cherry blossoms drifted down, settling over the shattered steel. Fragility and strength side by side. I once thought honor was measured in how others looked at me, he murmured. Now I see it is measured in how we choose to stand and who we choose to stand with. Tomoe said nothing, only rested her hand over his, steady as stone. The silence between them spoke louder than words, a vow carried by the wind into the next generation. If this story touched you, if you felt the weight of whispers or the courage of standing side by side, then join us. Subscribe and walk with us through more forgotten tales of Japan. Stories of honor, sacrifice, and unexpected strength, where every shadow hides a lesson waiting to be seen.